There comes a moment in some people's lives when they can no longer pretend they are strong. No more speeches, no more confidence, no more carefully constructed image. Only exhaustion, only pain, only the raw truth of a soul that has reached its limit. David was about to enter that moment. The years of waiting had already wounded him. The years of silence had already tested him. But now, everything would become worse. Far worse. David and his men had settled in a place called Ziklag. After years of running, it offered something they had not experienced in a very long time. Stability, a place to sleep, families nearby, children laughing, wives waiting for them to return home. For the first time in years, life almost felt normal. Not perfect, but normal. And perhaps that made what happened next even more devastating, because pain often strikes hardest when people finally begin believing they are safe. David and his men returned from a military campaign expecting to see smoke from cooking fires, to hear familiar voices, to embrace their families. Instead, they saw smoke rising into the sky. Dark smoke, thick smoke, the kind of smoke that immediately tells you something is terribly wrong. As they drew closer, their worst fears became reality. Ziklag was gone, burned, destroyed, reduced to ashes, homes destroyed, dreams destroyed, security destroyed, everything familiar destroyed, and the people they loved, gone. Their wives were gone, their children were gone, their families had been taken captive. Imagine that moment. Imagine David standing in silence, looking at blackened ruins, looking at the remains of everything he tried to build. Perhaps for a few seconds, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Sometimes grief arrives like that, too large to process immediately, too overwhelming to understand, too painful to believe. Then reality crashes down all at once, and suddenly the weight becomes unbearable. The Bible describes what happened next in a way that feels painfully human. David and his men wept, not politely, not quietly, not with dignified restraint. They wept until they had no strength left to weep. Think about that phrase, no strength left to weep. Their grief was so overwhelming. Their bodies physically exhausted themselves. Tears ran out, energy ran out, hope ran out, and perhaps some viewers understand exactly what that feels like. The phone call that changed everything, the diagnosis, the betrayal, the loss, the moment life split into before and after, the moment when words disappear because pain is simply too large. David had endured years of uncertainty, years of silence, years of waiting, but this felt different. This felt personal. This felt cruel. This felt like the final blow. And then something happened that pushed David even closer to the edge. His own men turned against him. These were not strangers. These were men who had suffered beside him, men who had followed him, trusted him, believed in him. But grief can become dangerous when it has nowhere to go. People desperately search for someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to hold responsible. And in that moment, David became the target. The Bible says his men spoke of stoning him. Imagine the loneliness. Not only had he lost his family, not only had he lost his home, now he was losing his closest companions. The people who once stood beside him were now considering killing him. This may have been the lowest point of David's entire life, lower than the caves, lower than Saul's pursuit, lower than the years of waiting, because now everything seemed broken at once. His future, his family, his leadership, his security, his relationships, everything. And perhaps this is the moment most people never see coming. The moment when faith faces its greatest test. Not when life is difficult, but when life becomes unbearable. There is a difference. Many people can survive difficulty. Few people know what to do when everything collapses simultaneously. And yet, Hidden inside this disaster is one of the most powerful verses in David's story, a verse so small that many readers pass over it without noticing, but it may contain the entire message of this video. The Bible says, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Read that again. Not God immediately rescued him. Not God immediately answered him. Not God immediately fixed everything. First, David strengthened himself in the Lord. Why is that important? Because David had finally reached a place where there was nothing left to depend on except God. No army could solve this. No strategy could solve this. No human wisdom could solve this. Everything else had failed. And perhaps that is where true faith begins. Not when God is all you have, but when you finally realize He is all you ever needed. Imagine David walking through the ashes, the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, the cries of grieving men surrounding him, the weight of uncertainty crushing his chest. And somewhere in that devastation, he turned toward God again, not because he understood, not because he had answers, not because the silence had ended, but because despite everything, he still believed God was there. That kind of faith is different. It is not emotional excitement. It is not optimism. It is not confidence based on circumstances. It is trust born in darkness. Trust that survives when feelings disappear. Trust that remains when explanations vanish. Trust that keeps moving forward even while carrying wounds. And perhaps this is why David's story still speaks to people thousands of years later, because eventually everyone encounters a Ziklag, a season where something precious burns, a season where prayers seem unanswered, a season where life no longer makes sense, a season where even faithful people wonder if they can continue. The question is not whether those moments come. The question is, what happens when they do? Will bitterness take control? Will despair take control? Will fear take control? Or will faith survive one more day? David did not yet know it, but the silence that nearly destroyed him was about to reveal its purpose. The years of waiting, the caves, the loneliness, the unanswered prayers, none of them had been meaningless. God had been preparing him for this exact moment, because a throne requires strength, but a kingdom requires something deeper, a heart that knows how to trust God when everything else is gone. And soon, for the first time in years, David would finally begin to see what God had been doing all along. The silence was not the end of the story. It was preparation for the revelation.